the general class of statements where it's very difficult to tell whether they're true or false because in some sense they're underspecified or they decompose into other statements are known as exponable statements. And these have been a problem since basically forever in logic. They're kind of one of the classic logical difficulties. They cause a lot of headache for some medieval logicians. And, their kind of classic example is stuff like, when did Socrates begin X, Y, and Z? Or like, actually, you know what? Teenage boys are like absolute masters at coming up with exponable statements. I think that the classic one, when I was a teenager, was, does your mum know you're gay? and I don't know if you've seen it. There's this, because this is a fantastic Instagram reel for anyone that's interested about the kind of logical decomposition of exponable statements. Which is that there's a guy and he says to somebody across the table, when I click my fingers, you'll forget that you're ever gay. And then he clicks his fingers, and then the guy goes, what are you talking about? I was never gay. No. He goes, see, it works. And I remember thinking about this when I was a teenager a little bit. It's sort of, well, this seems like this
happened to you a lot, did it?
Yeah, of course. Look at me. This is exactly the kind of insult that is finely tuned to my presentation and manner. And this, the statement like, does your mum know you're gay? Effectively decomposes into, proposition 1, you are gay, and proposition B, your mum knows about it. So
yeah, because there's no way you can't say like, yes, my mum knows I'm gay, but you also can't say, no, my mum doesn't know I'm gay.
Well, that is if you're not gay. If you're gay, then you have a perfectly sensible answer.
You can say yes to at least one of those, yeah.
The idea is that it's got a kind of nested claim within the broader structure.
Right.
And that's, an exponable statement. So, if any of you are watching and people say this at school, you can say, I'm afraid, good sir, that's an exponable statement. And as a result, I will decompose it into its separate propositions and choose to deny or affirm them individually. And I'm sure that the bullying will stop after you say something like that. But I just kind of use that as an illustrative example to show that, this is... exponable statements are very, very commonplace. They're kind of all over the shop, and Russell is dealing with just one of them. And if you want to give a kind of truth functional analysis where you maintain your sharp division between true and false, then you tend to decompose exponable statements into.
So wait, so how would a logician approach a question like that?
Well, they would say there's an implicit claim within the present King of France is bald, that there is a present King of France, and that he is bald.
So would they say it's false?
Well, they would say it's false.
So it's false that the current King of France is gay. And if I'm sorry.
Well, that would also be an exponable statement.
That would be
that also works, because the reason it's false is just because there's no present King of France.
Okay, but then then if I asked you, Joe, like, does your mum know that the King of France is gay? Would that same logician say yes or no, or would they just reject the question?
They'd say it was false. They'd say that one of the claims, well, if they were giving a kind
they
of
would say no.
decompositional analysis of this, they would say that one of the implicit claims is that the present King of France is gay,
because really,
and that's false.
Really, the phrase would not be like, my mum doesn't know the King of France is gay.
So we can think of this.
It is not the case that my mum knows the King of France is gay.
Yeah, so they would say that this is a conjunction of two claims. One, the present King of France is gay or bald, or literally whatever property you want to assign to the present King of France.
Yeah.
And my mum knows about this. And of course, the conjunction of those is false, because the left hand of it is false. And that, a conjunction is only true if both sides are true. So that's how that would be one way of
But suppose I said, like, the current King of France is non-existent.
Yes.
That's true.
Yeah, but that would be analysed as there does not exist an X.
And this is where the language of logic becomes really important, because you need to be able to translate a statement like that into a form that makes sense. So whereas I said, the current King of France is bald, and the current King of France does not exist. That kind of sounds like I'm saying the same kind of thing twice, but I'm not. 'Cause in the first case, I'm saying there is a King of France such that he is bald. And in the other case, it's like there is not a King of France.
Yes, exactly. One way of thinking about this.
That way, you can see they're not the same kind of statement. But that's to do with how you formalize the sentence.
And I think that intuitively, a lot of listeners may have encountered this when they're looking at the ontological argument. Famously, one of the responses to the ontological argument is that existence isn't a predicate. And this is just kind of the same sort of thing, saying that, existence isn't a property of the thing. When you say the present king of France does not exist. You're not saying that there is a present king of France and he doesn't exist. That's absurd. You're saying that there is no present king of France. Those statements are equivalent. So that's kind of. But these are another. This does just illustrate another incredibly useful tool for logical analysis, which is that you can take statements that at first seem very, very confusing, and you can break them down into parts and then get a clearer grip on what exactly they mean. Alternatives, because there are logicians that hold that there's genuine vagueness in the world, or that there are statements that are genuinely of indeterminate or gradable truth value, and these are fuzzy logicians.
Well, they're not fuzzy logicians. They're
logicians in fuzzy logic.
Yeah, exactly. That's a better way of putting it.
And, or many-valued logic.
So what is fuzzy logic? What is that?
So fuzzy logic is a form of many-valued logic. So many-valued logic, very, very broadly, is just any logic that has more than two truth values. So there's a Polish logician, and I can't pronounce his name, but it's spelt like it's pronounced Lukasiewicz, and it's definitely not pronounced like that. But it's one of the ones I've only seen written down. And he came up with lots and lots of different many-valued logics. Probably the two most important ones are a three-valued logic, where you've got true, false, and half, or 0, 1, and half, because obviously he's kind of assigning it in numbers, and an infinite valued logic, whereby you have 0 and 0.1 and 0.01, and you've got literally the whole.
You've got this continuum between 0 and 1.
Yes, you've got the whole.
0 is false, 1 is true, and you've got this.
Yes, you've got this entire continuum in between the two.
What do you mean then? So take a form of logic, a fuzzy logic that says that there are three kinds of truth value. There's 0, 1, and 0.5. So 0 means it's false, 1 means it's true. What does 0.5 mean? So what does that actually mean?
Well, the logic itself would not impose an interpretation on that. It's just a series of rules. But you might think of that as, depending on what interpretation you're using, you might think of that as indeterminate. You might think of it as vague. You might, I'm sure that there are some interpretations where it's just like, I don't know. There are, the infinitely many valued ones. You might think that you might use that to, if you were to embed that in something like a doxastic or epistemic logic, you might want to use gradability to represent confidence or something like that. There are types of fuzzy logic that mesh quite well with probability theory, so some people want to use them in that way. But the interesting thing about fuzzy logic doesn't denote a single logical system or even a single definition for logical connectors. It denotes more of a kind of general vibe, I suppose. It's any logic that has this kind of continuous truth values between 0 and 1, and the actual definitions of the connectives like and or implication or by implication will be different. They will cache those out in slightly different ways, and as a result, they'll end up with slightly different values for their sentences. But it's a logic that is quite often used to deal with vagueness or uncertainty or something like that.
You just mentioned epistemic logic. What's that?
So epistemic logic is well, let's start with modal logic, because epistemic logic uses a lot of the same tools as modal logic. Again, I'm keeping things very, very non-technical. Modal logic is a logic that is aimed to study necessity and possibility. So, we talk about this kind of thing in philosophy a lot. You might say, well, is X necessarily true? Is it merely possibly true? Is it true in this world? And modal logic allows you to talk about this kind of stuff. So,
the logic we've been talking about so far is like a statement is either true or false.
Yes, that's classical logic.
But a statement can be true. Like it's true that 2 and 2 is 5. It's also true that this chair is brown.
Yes,
but it seems it's not necessarily true that the chair is brown. It could have been blue, but it seems necessarily true that 2 and 2 is 5. 2 and 2 is 4. So there seems to be this different kind of truth. There's necessary truth, and there's possible truth. And so modal logic is attempting to take that into consideration.
Yes, and
so it's the logic of possibility and necessity.
Yes, exactly. And so the way that this is cashed out on a kind of model system, the kind of the model theory for modal logic uses something called Kripke modeling, which I assume was invented by Saul Kripke. I actually don't know, but it's called Kripke modeling, so you kind of hope so. And the idea is that you have a world where you intuitively live at. So you've got a world where Alex lives, And then you've got a bunch of possible worlds around you. And some of those, and what is necessary is the stuff that is true in all of the worlds that are accessible to your world. So this allows you to define different notions of possibility. So say you wanted to restrict your notion of possibility to restrict your notion of accessible worlds to only those worlds that share the same physical laws as your world. Well, then you've got a very, very neat, very systematic definition of physical possibility. Say you wanted to examine possibility but keep a few different propositions fixed, then you would effectively say, right, well, let's only have those worlds be accessible to our current world where these few propositions are fixed. And you can kind of play around with the modeling a bit like that. There are different restrictions on how the relationship of accessibility works, which gives you slightly different modal logics. But again, I don't know.
So starting simply, like we're using these ideas of other worlds. We're not talking about like a multiverse, like physical universe existing. It's just a way of thinking, right?
Yes,
so like there's there's another possible world that could have existed where like that table doesn't exist. So we just sort of conceptually think of it as like there is this possible world that is the same as this one, except that table doesn't exist.
Yes, we can think of them as well, for the purposes of discussion here anyway, we can think of them as just sets of propositions.
Yeah.
So we think of them as you've got a series of propositions,
a consistent
that are true.
Set of propositions.
Yes, well, depending on who you ask, there are people that do impossible world semantics, where in order to model, impossibilities, they will allow for certain worlds to have inconsistent sentences.
Oh. There are also modal realists who believe that actually David Lewis who think that these possible worlds are actually real worlds. They actually like truly exist. That's a little bit fringe, but it's usually just a way of thinking about the world. So if I want to say, like, one way of me saying it's possible that I could have not existed, that was possible, I can rephrase that as there is a possible world in which I do not exist.
Yes, and that would allow you to treat that sentence in a modal logic rigorously and comfortably.
Yeah.
This same framework ends up being really, really handy for a whole bunch of other things. So, classic question: what do you mean by believe? Comes up a lot at the moment. And a doxastic or epistemic logician would look at that question and say, I know exactly what I mean by believe. By believe, I mean it's true at every possible world that is accessible to me. Which is effectively saying, imagine that you're an agent living at World 1, and you've got a series of worlds that you're considering, let's say, to give it a kind of psychological interpretation. Well, then, everything that's true at every world that you're considering is effectively what you believe, is the kind of reasoning that an epistemic or doxastic logician might use to justify their kind of their usage of this framework of necessity to deal with things like belief and knowledge. They're not saying that they're using the same logical apparatus, but they're giving a different interpretation to the symbols. And this is, I think, again, something that really illustrates just how handy logic can be, is that sometimes you design something that's to be used for something totally different to a new usage, and then suddenly you find that actually this kind of broad idea of necessity, if you kind of relativize the interpretation to an agent and you don't think of possible worlds as possibilities, but instead as worlds that this agent could be considering, then actually you have a very neat formal system for dealing with belief and knowledge.
Take that, Jordan Peterson.
Well, and that's just one way of dealing with belief. You could talk about it a whole series of other ways. But I think that this is at the very least a very good way of formally treating belief.